The 1974 United Kingdom one new pence coin, carrying the familiar portrait of Queen Elizabeth II, sits right in the middle of one of the most fascinating monetary transitions in modern British history. An era when the British public was still adjusting to decimalization, when the word new stamped onto the smallest denominations served as both a reminder of change and a symbol of modernization. This copper-plated bronze coin, struck by the Royal Mint in 1974, was part of the first generation of fully decimal coinage that had only recently replaced the centuries-old pounds, shillings, pence system in 1971, a system so deeply rooted in daily life that it required several transitional years for people to feel comfortable with modern decimal values. The obverse features the young portrait of Queen Elizabeth II, sculpted by Arnold Machin, the second definitive effigy used on British decimal coins. She appears elegant and poised, wearing the Girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara, a design chosen for its clarity on small coins and its ability to reflect both tradition and youthfulness during that period of her reign. The inscription, Elizabeth II DG Reg. FD 1974, surrounds the portrait, abbreviating the Latin De Gratia Regina Fidei Defensor, meaning by the grace of God, Queen, Defender of the Faith, a traditional formula appearing on British coinage for centuries. On the reverse is Christopher Ironside's distinctive crowned portcullis, a heavy medieval gate with vertical bars and chains, symbolizing the House of Commons and representing authority, governance, and the stabilizing presence of the British Parliament, chosen precisely because it was a non-royal emblem suitable for lower denominations in the newly restructured currency. The inscription New Penny was still used at this time to reduce confusion among the public, making clear that this was not the old pre-decimal penny. The term would remain until 1981, when it shifted to 1 penny after the transition period officially ended. The 1974 issue was struck for general circulation, though the mintage was noticeably lower than the bustling early decimal years, making it interesting to collectors not because it is rare or particularly valuable, but because it represents a quieter, steady year in British coinage where the new system had begun to feel normal across the United Kingdom. Although millions were minted, the majority have lived long, hard lives in circulation. Worn surfaces, softened details on the portcullis, darkened copper tones, and pocket-polished patina are extremely common, giving surviving coins a sense of everyday historical weight rather than pristine rarity. In terms of composition, it follows the original decimal bronze standard: 97% copper, 2.5% zinc, 0.5% tin, a warm reddish mix that tended to darken over the years, especially after environmental exposure. What makes this coin especially interesting from a numismatic historical perspective is not its monetary value, but its position in a timeline. An early decimal piece carrying the Machin portrait, the new denomination wording, the classic Ironside design, and the economic flavor of mid-1970s Britain. A time of inflation, industrial struggle, political tension, and cultural change that rippled across every aspect of society, including the coins in people's pockets. For collectors today, the 1974 one new pence is a common and accessible entry-level historical piece, often kept as part of full-year sets, decimalization collections, or Machin portrait sequences, and its value is mainly sentimental or educational unless the coin happens to survive in exceptional mint state condition. Something surprisingly difficult to find because these coins circulated heavily for decades before being gradually withdrawn after the small denomination redesigns of the early 1980s and later changes in alloy composition. Still, for anyone studying the evolution of British currency, the 1974 issue is a quiet but important chapter. It sits at the crossroads between old and new Britain, between tradition and modernization, between ancient monarchy and 20th century economic reform, embodying the slow settling in of decimal money and the visual consistency that would define British coins for the next generation. And so the one new pence from 1974 endures, not as a rare treasure, but as a charming, tangible relic of the moment Britain let go of centuries of complex money mathematics and walked toward a simpler decimal future, guided by a stable monarchy, a proud minting tradition, and a nation adapting together coin by coin next top two. The 1976 one new pence coin stands as a fascinating little metal snapshot of Britain's changing monetary identity during the decade when decimalization was still relatively fresh and the nation was adjusting to a new way of thinking about money. And even though it looks small and humble, It carries layers of political, economic, artistic, and cultural meaning that tell a surprisingly big story. This coin, minted by the Royal Mint in 1976, belongs to the early era of the new pence system. Introduced in 1971, a reform that replaced the centuries-old pounds, shillings, pence structure with a clean decimal format where 100 new pence equaled 1 pound, and Britain was determined to ensure clarity by stamping coins with new pence so citizens, many of whom were older and deeply attached to the old system, would not mix them up with the old pre-decimal pennies, the 1 new pence. Coin itself was struck in bronze, created from a mixture of 97% copper, 2.5% zinc, and 0.5% tin, giving it that warm reddish-brown tone that ages into deeper shades over decades, and the piece weighs 3.56 grams, measures 20.3 millimeters in diameter, and has a smooth plain edge, a design choice meant to keep the smallest coins simple and inexpensive to produce. The obverse features the familiar image of Queen Elizabeth II, but specifically the Arnold Machin portrait, introduced in 1968 and used on British coinage until the mid-1980s. This portrait shows the Queen young, serene, wearing the Girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara, an elegant and recognizable diadem she wore on many official occasions. Machin's design became beloved because it struck a perfect balance between modern simplicity and royal dignity, making the Queen feel both accessible and stately on the everyday change in people's pockets. Around the portrait are the inscriptions Elizabeth II and Dean G. Reg. F.D., the Latin shorthand for De Gratia Regina Fidei Defensor, meaning by the grace of God, Queen, Defender of the Faith, a traditional title carried by English and later British monarchs since the 1500s. The reverse of the coin, designed by Christopher Ironside, shows the crown portcullis, a symbol deeply tied to the Palace of Westminster and centuries of parliamentary history, referencing Britain's stable, though evolving, constitutional identity and evoking images of government, tradition, and authority. This design was chosen to represent the democratic institutions of the United Kingdom without elevating any specific person or political party, making it a symbol that wore well across years of cultural change. The inscription New Pence appears above, along with the large numeral 1 beneath. And this was the standard format until 1982, when Britain finally felt the public had fully converted to decimal thinking and changed the text to simply 1 penny. In the wider world, 1976 was a year of economic anxiety in Britain as inflation, rising prices, and pressure on the pound created a sense of instability, and this coin circulated during a time when regular people were feeling the pinch. Still, small bronze coins like the 1 new pence were part of everyday life, used in buses, sweet shops, milk deliveries, phone boxes, newspapers, and tiny daily transactions that defined ordinary living. For children, the 1p coin was often their first encounter with money, an object traded in playgrounds for marbles or candies, and so it carries a nostalgia that many adults still smile at today. The 1976 issue was produced in huge numbers, meaning it is not rare, but collectors value it for its place in the story of Britain's currency evolution and for the way it represents the late 20th century era of the Queen's long reign. Circulated examples are extremely common and normally only worth face value, while well-preserved uncirculated or brilliant uncirculated examples may be worth a bit more, but still remain modest in price due to high mint quantities. What makes the 1976 1 new pence interesting is not its market value, but its symbolism. It is a coin anchored in the optimism of modernizing Britain, carrying the young Queen's portrait during a pivotal era, and serving as a quiet reminder of how a nation can reinvent itself through something as small and ordinary as a penny. Today, this coin sits in albums, jars, attic boxes, and the treasured collections of people who appreciate the long story behind even the tiniest piece of coppery metal that once traveled through the hands of millions. Next, top 3. The 1977 1 new pence coin sits in a really interesting spot in the timeline of British coinage, because it comes out of that era right after the Great Decimalization of 1971, when the United Kingdom flipped its entire currency system from centuries-old pounds, shillings, pence into the modern decimal structure. The little bronze 1 new pence was one of the first generation of decimal coins that the public grew up with, so by 1977 it had already become a familiar companion in pockets, purses, vending machines, phone boxes, and school children's hands. But it still carried the new in its name, a leftover from the transitional period, because the Royal Mint hadn't yet dropped the word new. That change would come in 1982. Your coin from 1977 is made of bronze, specifically a copper-tin zinc alloy, round and lightweight at 3.56 grams, 20.3 millimeters in diameter, and with a plain, smooth edge. On the obverse, you get the very classic and widely circulated portrait of Queen Elizabeth II by Arnold Machin, the design introduced in 1968 and used into the mid-1980s, showing the young queen wearing the tiara gifted by her grandmother Queen Mary. Machin's portrait is beloved because it presents Elizabeth with calm dignity, youthfulness, and a kind of reassuring consistency in a turbulent time, and it's also the portrait that ended up on billions of coins across the Commonwealth. Around her effigy you read Elizabeth II DG Reg FD, short for Dei Gratia Regina Fidei Defensor, meaning by the grace of God, Queen, Defender of the Faith. And of course your coin carries the 1977 date, a year that was huge for the monarchy because it marked the Silver Jubilee, celebrating the Queen's 25 years on the throne. Even though the one new pence didn't get a special Jubilee design, only the crown/25p coin did. The regular 1977 penny still forms part of that historical moment and ends up feeling a bit symbolically tied to the celebrations that swept the UK. Flip to the reverse, and you see Christopher Ironside's iconic crown portcullis, the same heraldic gate associated with the Palace of Westminster and used for centuries as a symbol of Parliament. The portcullis with chains and crown expresses the authority of government, continuity of the state, and the idea of strong but orderly power. It's a classic medieval design adapted into modern coinage, and Ironside's version is crisp, symmetrical, and instantly recognizable. The inscription New Pence arches above, with the numeral 1 boldly centered below. By 1977, the British public had accepted these designs as normal, but the coins still felt more modern compared to the pre-decimal pieces that older generations missed. As for minting, 1977 saw a large number of these coins produced for everyday circulation. The Royal Mint pumped out hundreds of millions because the penny was still heavily used for transactions, machine payments, and making change in a cash-heavy society. The coin's material, bronze, would remain standard until 1992, when inflation pushed the mint to switch to copper-plated steel for cost efficiency. So your 1977 penny comes from the era when coins were still fully bronze, and thus have that warm reddish-brown tone collectors like. Over the decades, environmental exposure, humidity, handling, and pocket give these coins a variety of patinas. Some dark chocolate, some reddish, some almost black. Historically, the one new pence coin is important because it represents the first decade of decimalized Britain, a time when the country was reshaping everything from currency to culture. Economically, the mid-1970s UK was wrestling with inflation, political turbulence, and social upheaval, but coins like this acted as tiny daily constants. Numismatically, the 1977 issue isn't rare. It's easy to find, but its interest comes from its place in the Jubilee year and the sentimental value it holds for anyone who lived through the time. For collectors, its worth usually depends on condition. Circulated pieces have mostly sentimental value, while sharp, uncirculated specimens with full luster are nicer but still affordable because of high mintage numbers. But for people who love history, and you clearly do, the value lies in how this coin captures the everyday life of the late 1970s. Buses costing pennies, chocolate bars priced in single digits, arcades where the smallest coins mattered, and households still adjusting to a money system that felt newer than many remembered. Your 1977 one new pence, then, is a tiny time capsule from a year of royal celebration and a country still finding its footing, carrying on its face the queen who guided the era, and on its reverse a symbol of Parliament that anchored the nation's identity. It's simple, humble, and common, yet historically loaded, politically symbolic, and quietly beautiful in its own way. Next top 4. The 1981 new pence coin from the United Kingdom sits right at the tail end of a fascinating transitional period in modern British coinage, a time when the country was living through economic unrest, industrial change, political tension, and the lingering aftershocks of decimalization, a massive monetary overhaul only a decade old. Struck in bronze by the Royal Mint, and bearing the familiar inscription Elizabeth II DG Reg FD on the obverse, the coin features the elegant and youthful portrait of Queen Elizabeth II engraved by Arnold Machin, whose depiction became iconic across Commonwealth coinage for decades. This portrait radiated calm stability during years when Britain itself was wrestling with inflation, labor strikes, and a changing relationship with Europe. The coin's reverse carries the inscription "1 new pence" with the famous badge of the Prince of Wales, consisting of 3 ostrich feathers emerging from a coronet with the motto "Ich diene, I serve," a symbol that connected the coin to centuries of royal heraldry, even as the UK had recently modernized its currency. This badge wasn't random. It reflected a deliberate royal mint effort to give each decimal denomination a sense of dignity and tradition, making new coins feel authentically British instead of alien numbers replacing shillings and pence. By 1980, the word "new" was still printed on the denomination because the public had taken surprisingly long to adjust to decimal money after its introduction in 1971. Some people still calculated in old shillings, so "new pence" was meant to keep confusion at bay. Within a few years, however, the mint would drop "new" and switch entirely to 1 penny, making 1980 one of the later years of this earlier label. The coin was produced in huge circulation numbers, meaning it isn't rare today, but that doesn't make it uninteresting. Each piece represents a physical artifact from the early Thatcher era, a time when Britain was undergoing privatization, economic restructuring, and social change, and these small bronze discs quietly traveled through pockets, markets, wages, and daily exchanges of a nation in transition. The metal, a copper-rich bronze alloy, aged beautifully over time, often developing warm brown or deep chocolate tones, and collectors today often appreciate the varying patinas that formed naturally as coins circulated across Britain's damp, cool climate. Though common, the 1981 new pence holds numismatic charm because it marks the end of a naming system and the final years of Mackin's portrait before the Royal Mint updated the Queen's effigy in mid-1980s to reflect her maturing reign. For some collectors, this coin symbolizes the tail end of the decimal novelty period, when shops still displayed dual pricing charts and older generations still grumbled that sixpence was easier to understand. Historically, the coin is also part of a much larger economic narrative. Britain was fighting inflation, wages were unstable, and industries were collapsing, so small denominations like the 1p mattered a lot more to daily life than they do today. These coins carried emotional weight for families budgeting carefully, children buying sweets, and workers counting every last penny during tough financial years, making the piece a surprisingly intimate reflection of everyday British resilience. The Prince of Wales feathers, sitting proudly on the reverse, represented heritage, but at the same time, the coin itself was a symbol of modernization, a balancing act that defined the UK of the late 20th century. By 1980, the Royal Mint had also already moved operations from London's Tower Hill to its new facility in Llantrisant, Wales, meaning your coin was likely struck using some of the most modern minting technology of the period, giving it more precise lettering, sharper details, and better quality control than many earlier UK bronze issues. Even though its monetary value today is still just 1 penny, the historical and cultural story packed into this tiny bronze circle makes it a delightful artifact of a changing Britain, a snapshot of the early 1980s, a symbol of a young queen's steady reign, and a collectible that ties together heritage, economics, and everyday human life. And so, the 1981 new pence coin remains, quietly but proudly, one of those little numismatic time capsules that reminds us that even the smallest coin can carry a nation's history in the palm of your hand. Next top 5. The 1981 one new pence coin sits in an interesting little corner of British numismatic history, because by the time it was minted, the new pence era was already halfway through its life and slowly marching toward a major change that would happen just 2 years later. Issued during the reign of Queen Elizabeth II, this coin carries the familiar young bust of the Queen designed by Arnold Mackin, the portrait used from 1968 all the way until 1984. In this portrait, she faces right, wearing the elegant girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara, a piece so iconic that it became the default look of Elizabeth II on British coins for over a decade and a half. The obverse inscription reads Elizabeth II DG Reg FD 1981, which translates to Elizabeth II, by the grace of God, Queen, Defender of the Faith, a traditional formula on UK coins expressing the monarchy's constitutional and religious role. The reverse of the one new pence coin, unchanged since decimalization in 1971, features Christopher Ironside's design. The crown portcullis, a medieval-style gate symbol long used in British heraldry and famously associated with the Palace of Westminster. This little portcullis, topped by a crown, stood for the authority and stability of Parliament, making the smallest denomination coin carry a surprisingly weighty political symbol. The lettering New Pence arcs above, and the number 1 sits below, a style that would officially be replaced in 1982 with the more modern 1 penny inscription, meaning 1981 is technically one of the last years the new pence wording appeared in normal circulation. The coin itself is struck in bronze, an alloy of 97% copper, 2.5% zinc, and 0.5% tin, giving it that warm reddish-brown look that slowly darkens as it ages and reacts with air and oils from handling. The diameter is 20.3 millimeters, the weight 3.56 grams, and the thickness 1.52 millimeters, making it a small but sturdy coin that feels dense in the hand compared to modern steel pennies. Millions were minted for circulation in 1981, so it isn't rare in the typical sense. But the charm of these coins lies in the fact that they are part of the early decimal system that replaced centuries of shillings, farthings, and halfpennies. To understand the vibe of the 1981 issue, you have to picture the UK at the time. The country was deep in the Thatcher era. Industries were shifting, inflation was squeezing households, and decimal currency, introduced just 10 years earlier, had finally become fully normal to the British public. The little 1 new pence coin was part of everyday life. It rattled in children's pockets for arcade machines, it got taped to school projects about British money, and it was one of the most common coins given in change during the early 80s. And because 1981 was before the phrase changed to 1 penny, collectors today often treat these final new pence years as their own micro-era, with 1981 sitting right before the transitional 1982-83 redesign. Today, a circulated 1981 1 new pence coin usually carries low monetary value, but it has rich sentimental and historical value. It represents the late Mackin portrait period, the closing chapter of the new pence denomination style, and a snapshot of early 1980s British identity. In uncirculated or brilliant uncirculated condition, the coin can appear almost golden due to the high copper content, with sharp details on the Queen's hair waves and the crisp bars of the portcullis, making high-grade examples more collectible than their ordinary circulated counterparts. Although it is a common coin, it's one of those pieces that instantly teleports you into a specific era, a moment in UK monetary evolution when the country was still adjusting to decimal currency, and the coins of the realm were quietly shifting toward the designs that would dominate the rest of the century. Owning a 1981 1 new pence isn't about rarity. It's about holding a tiny copper bookmark from a time when British coins were simpler, heavier, and full of symbolism that most people didn't even realize they were carrying in their pockets.